really know like you're coming, when you're coming, but you're coming for sure. So we're so excited for tonight, and we're having fun.
Thank you. Come on. It's good to see all of you. I am Katelyn Beaty, and I'm just really excited for the conversation that we get to have with Chuck DeGroat tonight. We both wrote books about rather dark topics in the Christian world, but I think the two books that we have written are in natural conversation with each other, and I hope to bring that out for our benefit tonight, and then of course open up to multiple questions and comments you might have. Just a little bit about Chuck DeGroat. He is a professor of pastoral care and Christian spirituality at Western Seminary, and he's been there since 2013. You live here in Grand Rapids. You commute to Holland. You see some Dutch people in both places. Yes. I know what it's like. I went to Calvin, not a Dutch person, which I learned the first day I was there. I never made it in. You have written 5 books, most recently When Narcissism Comes to Church. I highly recommend this book, Healing Your Community from Emotional and Spiritual Abuse. I quote it in my book and actually got to interview you for my book about your work with, you've counseled hundreds of men and women in both individual and group settings, often people who are in positions of Christian leadership and navigating the personal and public dimensions of that. You are the co-founder of the New Begin House in San Francisco, and you live here with your wife, Sarah. You have 2 college-age daughters, and you have a golden doodle. But I don't know the golden doodle's name. Max. Thank you. So I know your work, Chuck. I mean, I have followed your work for several years, but I think your work on the darker dimension of Christian leadership really came onto my radar with the release of When Narcissism Comes to Church. I read it. It came out like right as the pandemic was starting. And so I have this very vivid memory of going to a park in Brooklyn and like trying to maintain 6 feet of distance from everybody and reading it in one sitting. And as I was writing Celebrities for Jesus, was thinking about the ways in which celebrity dynamics in the church can feed narcissism, and narcissism can also feed celebrity dynamics in the church. So tease that out a little bit for us. How do you think that they overlap, or can, or in your own experience, you see them feed into one another?
Yeah, so part of what we'll do tonight is we'll kind of go back and forth on some of these, because there are so many places of overlap in our books. And as I was reading Celebrities for Jesus, there are a number of things that I think I could choose from, but power, platform, and persona seemed most important in terms of the overlap. Power, of course, you quote Andy Crouch, power can bless, power can harm. But when we're talking about narcissism, we're talking about a power that coerces, a power that controls, right? Couple that with platform, and you talk so beautifully about power without social proximity, right? When I think of platform, I begin to think of a distance that's created, right, at that point. So you've got power coupled with platform. Now there's this growing distance between the pastor and the parishioner. And then you add on top of that persona, which is Katelyn really spells out in beautiful ways in her book. When I think about persona, there's not just the physical distance now, but the psychological distance. Persona is this kind of defensive mask, right? So that's a recipe for narcissism when we think about grandiosity and control and a lack of empathy, that relational distance that's created. I think that there are points of overlap that are really important there. Where did you see the points of overlap?
Yeah, well, in some ways, I wonder out loud in my book if, at least in many parts of the American church, we kind of prefer narcissistic leaders, or leaders who have narcissistic tendencies. Maybe they don't diagnose as narcissistic personality disorder, but entitlement and grandiosity. I think we are drawn to people who have a very strong sense of mission, that we can go on mission with. They have a kind of confidence. They are excellent speakers and kind of woo and wow with their charismatic presence. So I think about the ways that narcissism can not just be about a particular individual, but can be baked into a system. Can be, you call it collective narcissism, which you're referencing Gerald Post, but talking about the ways in which a leader and a community feed on each other. The leader gets ego gratification from all the people who are hanging on their every word and think that they have a divine mission, but then the people in the church also sense, wow, we get to go on this mission with that. And because we're special or uniquely blessed or divinely blessed in some way. I know that my podcast co-host and we teased this out with you over the summer. Like, which comes first in terms of pastoral responsibilities? Does the American church tend to attract people with kind of latent narcissistic you call them elevations around entitlement, grandiosity, or do our churches essentially make people narcissistic?
Yeah, and that's a really tough one, and I do think it's a both ends, right? But it's really interesting in the psychological assessments that I've done over the years. I will work with candidates who seem at the time to be quite open to conversation about potential dynamics in their own lives that they need to be aware of, right? Pain in their past, things like that. But what's interesting is that when they get into the role of senior pastor and they begin to climb the ladder, with that comes growing anxiety, oftentimes. And with growing anxiety, growing defensiveness, that sense that I've got to protect myself, the autonomic nervous system kicks in, right? The primitive sort of survival mechanisms kick in. And with that, greater invulnerability. I've got to protect myself. There's more of a threat. So in the beginning, when we did our assessments, there's some openness. Yeah, I'm willing to talk about my life and my family. But now that I've climbed the ladder and I've gained power, I'm more anxious. There's more to lose, right? So with that anxiety, more distance, more invulnerability, and a lack of capacity to really hear from others or invite others in for feedback. And so it's really tough to answer that question, but that's generally what I see. And that's really frustrating for someone who wants to believe that there's like a single assessment that I can give where, boom, I've got it. And that person is on a narcissistic track. No, not necessarily. It may just be that they find their way into a position, they start climbing the ladder, the anxiety grows, and they're off to the races. Does that make sense? Yeah.
One of the questions that I get asked a lot in conversations about celebrities for Jesus, and I think all of us have thought or wondered out loud in recent years as we see disturbing and discouraging headlines about fallen celebrity pastors and leaders, is basically like, why do we keep doing this? Like, why do we keep putting people on pedestals who, I would say, a sober-minded person could kind of see some early warning signs, and yet we keep doing it. We keep kind of circling around or centering our churches and ministries around people who have narcissistic tendencies, who have anger problems, who have addiction problems. Yeah, why do we keep doing this? What do you think we're getting out of?
Yeah, so let's tag team on this, right? Because I think you do a really beautiful sort of historical cultural analysis of this, right? And that gets at it to some degree. So I'll be quick. I mean, because you already named it to some degree. There's a symbiotic relationship. This kind of collective narcissism is what we call it. Gerald Post was the first to sort of write on this, a CIA profiler who's written about anyone from Bill Clinton to Donald Trump. He talks about this collective narcissism kind of dynamic where you've got the mirror-hungry leader and the ideal-hungry follower. You know, the mirror-hungry leader who says, feed me, feed me, feed me, look at me, give me your approval, clap, applaud. tell me I'm great. And the ideal hungry follower, of course, who says, if I plug into this church and his leadership, I'll get that sense of belonging that I deeply long for. If I'm by his side, I'll feel empowered in a way that I've longed to be empowered. Those are some of the psychological dynamics. I'm curious what you've learned in your work around this, particularly as you think about some of the cultural and historical dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, I devote a chapter to trying to sum up all of American evangelical history in 5,000 words, which is challenging, but I focus on three, what I argue are the kind of quintessential first American evangelical celebrities: Dwight Moody, Billy Sunday, and Billy Graham, and just a tendency theologically and culturally within evangelicalism to prefer to center ministries around kind of charismatic individual figures over and against rote or dead institutions. That we find it easier to place our trust and look to finding authority in a person rather than a body, rather than a community. And I write as someone who is grateful for the ministry of Billy Graham. I think he did wonderful things, and also the ways that he used mass media to project an image, I think might have been a little bit naive about how those media changed and altered the gospel and the message that he was presenting. And I also just, of course, think that institutions can carry on a legacy, a more durable legacy than an individual, because what you see happening in the stories of fallen celebrity leaders is that the institutions, the churches, the ministries have a really hard time recovering after the fall of the one person. Like, if the one person can raise it all up, they can also bring it all down. And of course, we want to talk about accountability and accountability structures, but I'm just, I think I'm increasingly anxious or suspicious of any kind of Christian organization or body that feels centered on the one person, even if they're very gifted and grounded, because I think, where is this leading us in 20 or 30 years when they're no longer in the spotlight? When you think about the durability over time.
As you traced it back, all the way back, late 19th century, Dwight L. Moody, Billy Graham, did you notice warning signs? I mean, are there particular kinds of warning signs that you see in these leaders? Of course, we look at Billy Graham and we want to say, so good and so positive, and there was tremendous fruit. But what gets you nervous when you look at someone like a Billy Graham? If you could say it out loud in this intimate audience, no one else is listening right now. No one online.
I don't know who's watching.
There
Maybe
is
Franklin,
zero.
I don't know.
Zero people watching right now, so it's just us right here. But if you were to be just a little bit more pointed in your challenge, your criticism, is that fair? I'm a therapist, so.
Yes. Childhood wounds. Yeah, I mean, I think, part of my answer is theological. I mean, the crux of our faith is lived out. It only makes sense lived out in a body of believers. Every part is essential. And so if you're, thinking about Paul's image of the body of Christ, but all the attention is going to Ted, who's very loud and very directive. What does that communicate to the rest of the body about their belonging, about their place in the body? I think about, others have written about a kind of cult of leadership as a concept in the American Christian church, that we tend to think of giftedness as someone who has a direct decisive leadership gifts. Well, Paul writes about hospitality. Paul writes about caring for people who are suffering. These gifts are just as important.
Yes.
So some of it is, I just tend to think that we have lost a vision of the ordinary faithfulness that all Christians are called to participate in, the more that we center on the one charismatic figure.
you talk about the icons versus the idols, right? Which I think is really a beautiful distinction. The ordinary image bearer versus the idol. Versus we laud, we lift up.
Yeah, and obviously, you know, as we have seen in so many stories, when you idolize somebody, when you idolize a flawed human being, no matter how much they've enriched your life or your spirituality, you can turn a blind eye to real problems. You know, the people who end up abusing their power wouldn't be able to do so if they didn't have other people enabling them. And part of that comes to, well, I think that they're called by God, or they blessed my life, so this couldn't be true, the things that we're hearing or that are coming to light, so that idolization can also enable abuse, and I think has in a lot of these stories. So it's a bit of a weird thing to try to promote a book critiquing celebrity and self-promotion. You have to participate in the thing. So
Literal platform.
I have an earpiece, images projected on the Facebook Live. So launching this book has been a helpful exercise, helpful and hard sometimes exercise in examining, are there things in myself as a writer, speaker, communicator that could fall into the very things that I'm critiquing? And you write in When Narcissism Comes to Church, all of us have narcissistic tendencies, and they can be minor and they can be exaggerated, and there can even be a healthy narcissism.
Yeah.
How do we, I guess I'm talking about you and me, but I guess hopefully this is instructive for other people. How do we be wise, looking for warning signs that we don't fall into the very things that we're out there critiquing? Like, how do you do that in a reflective work?
Yeah. Well, you and I think, have talked about this on the podcast too. This question that I asked, I've asked for 15 years. And the question is, how do you experience me? The people in my life, my students, when I was a pastor in San Francisco and Orlando, people I counseled, people I pastored, people on staff, people who reported to me, people I reported to, that there was this question, how do you experience me? That's one piece of it. And of course, that points to relationship. Who do you have in your life who knows you? I think when you talked about social power without proximity, that felt to me, I mean, that might be the single most important line in Katelyn's whole book, if you've read it, because there's this sense of growing distance that comes with power, right? And so what we understand about narcissism is that with narcissism, there's this lack of empathy, this incapacity for vulnerability that shows up. And so the question has been for me over the years, how do I remain in vulnerable relationship? Who knows me? Who knows my story? Who knows my patterns? Not just one-off things, right? Because anyone could come and say, you said something inappropriate tonight, that one-off thing that you said tonight, Chuck. But to know my patterns and to be able to say, I've seen this over the course of a number of months, and I want to bring it up to you. Let's have a conversation about it. Or who are you talking to? Just today, a good friend came into my office and said, you look really tired. And I think you're holding a lot of things right now. Are you taking care of yourself? And that was a really important question for him to ask. And then it's on me to answer honestly. I could have said, no, it's great. You know, God is good. Things are great. God is really blessing everything. No, I said, I'm really, really tired right now. Thanks for asking. If you want to hear more detail, we had a longer conversation. I think that's part of it. I'm curious, and in all the interviews you've done, what are you hearing? What do you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think the proximity piece is really key. And that's something that I have had to work to cultivate in terms of having in-person relationships that stand the test of time, where someone who I know loves me and who I trust, you know, they can answer the question, how do you experience me? And I can actually receive it without becoming defensive or feeling like, well, you're not supporting me or whatever it is. So just, I've lots of interviews and all the promotional work, but really being intentional about taking time to reconnect with friends and family throughout the week and on the weekends to kind of be regrounded, because I think it can be easy to start believing your own hype, which is the thing that I am critiquing in this book, to kind of cling to the public self or the false self for a sense of security, validity, lovability. Yeah. And of course, I think all of this is like solved by Jesus, but staying grounded in the truth of your belovedness in Christ is an ongoing process.
Yeah, staying grounded feels like a really important phrase, right?
Yes.
Because I think the more we believe our own press, the more disembodied we become. Mm-hmm. And so paying close attention to what's going on inside us, feeling how our bodies are responding, right? Being honest about that, finding ways to remain anchored feels really important.
Mm-hmm. So we're both writing about hard things. Are you all hanging with us? I suppose there's no way to check in on the Facebook people, but I assume that I know my parents are tuning in. We are enjoying this. We're both writing about hard things. We're both writing critically about things that we have observed among brothers and sisters in Christ within the church. We are speaking as insider voices. We have seen things from within and we're concerned about particular dynamics. And when I worked at Christianity Today magazine, of course, we often had to report difficult news about various leaders and organizations. And, a common response would be, in leveraging this critique, in reporting the bad news, in critiquing these dynamics, you're hurting the church. You're creating division, you're harming our public image. Satan is using this. I'm like, wow, okay. So how do you respond to that perspective? That in writing hard things, you might be unfairly or unduly critiquing fellow Christians and harming the body.
Yeah. Can you answer it next?
Mm-hmm.
Because the story you tell about your early interview with someone from RZIM and how you processed all that, I thought was fascinating. I don't know if you want to tell that story tonight, but I think that you are living in your own body the tension of how do I engage this? Mm-hmm. What do I say? How do I enter in? But yeah, it's a really good question.
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, you go first.
Okay.
I want to think about it for a second.
So yes, Chuck is alluding to the story really that started back in 2014 when the staff at Christianity Today received a tip about Rabbi Zacharias. The person was not ready to go on record, but we felt like we need to at least investigate this claim and start talking to people off the record. And it just so happened that in that time, I was being sent to profile another leader at RCIM in the ministry and write like a totally separately related thing about her. And I had spent a few days with her, interviewing her, getting to know her family, like putting off this thing. And at the very end, I asked, I know this is going to sound strange and probably is coming out of left field, but like, have you ever heard anything along these lines about Rabbi? And she was truly mortified. I believe that she truly had no idea what was going on. And I trusted her, I had no reason to believe that she was covering for him. And then the story really lay dormant for several years, until CT eventually was able to corroborate a lot of the allegations and report on Rabbi Zacharias in 2021. And that kicked off, all sorts of internal examination and internal investigation. The woman that I had profiled was one of the few people inside the organization to kind of ask hard questions and say, what he's telling us and what we're hearing elsewhere isn't lining up. Like, we need to do better diligence around this. And without fail, when CT reported this news, it came 4 or 5 months after Zacharias had passed away. And I think to some extent, I understand why people who trusted him as a leader, who had benefited from his teaching and writing, felt like, is this dishonoring of this person? How is this helpful? You know, like, shouldn't this just be dealt with kind of behind closed doors? And this is such a cliche, but it's an image that I think of a lot because I think it is true, which is that, you know, sunlight is the best disinfectant. We are people of the truth. We are people who desire to welcome the truth. We are to be truth tellers. We are also to be people who stand with people who have been harmed and who have suffered at the hands of people who have misused their power. And I don't think there is real healing for those people, but true repentance and change without the truth coming to light. And I think it often takes journalists to do that work. It's not fun, nor is it work that is done for the purpose of being salacious. I mean, I can genuinely say at Christianity Today, there was a real sense of responsibility. We better get this right, you know, if we're going to move forward with this. But I do believe that truth telling can lead to change and repentance that is hard to see if you're inside the system, you know, because you've had interactions with this person, you have a certain sense of this person. Like, there's such radical cognitive dissonance, you know, and that's really hard to work through. And so I don't ever think about journalistic work of this nature as gotcha. Yeah. It is really, you know, where angels fear to tread, yeah. But also we do need to go there.
Yeah. I think when I wrote mine, I was watching you and others at CT and thinking, oh no, this is not going to go well. And I was surprised by how little pushback I got. I think part of what I heard was, you have credibility because you're a pastor, right? So you weren't looking to go after us. I think at the same time, I go back to Ezekiel 34, right? Ezekiel 34 is where Ezekiel critiques the priests of the day. He says, you do not take care of the flock, you've not strengthened the weak, and you've ruled them harshly and brutally. And those are tough words. There's a psychotherapist named James Finley, who was with Thomas Burton at the Abbey of Gethsemane, went on to get his degree in counseling. And he asked the question, what happens in therapy? And he says, in therapy, we create the safety so that the masks we wear can be unmasked, so that the illusions of our lives can be exposed. And I think that there's something to that that's really important. I think as a pastor, that was part of my call as a therapist. That's part of my call, to unmask the illusions that we live by. I think this is what Jesus did in the first century. And by the way, he was crucified for it, right? But he was dealing with Sadducees and Pharisees and Essenes and Zealots, 4, if not more, ways of looking at the world. And he had to name the problem with that and point in a different kind of direction. And I think this is what we do. This is what we participate in. Paul did this as well. It's scary, it's risky, but I think it's got to be done.
So we're prophets.
That feels pretty great, huh? Prophets without proximity.
Yeah. No, that passage from Ezekiel is really powerful and gives a biblical precedent for holding the leaders of God's people to account when they misuse that great calling. So, related question, I think, also I'm sure it comes up a lot for you, it comes up for me in this conversation. What does redemption look like for the fallen celebrity leader? Is there redemption for the fallen celebrity leader? And if so, what does it look like? What do you counsel?
Yeah, so this is a very live question these days, right? If you follow Twitter, social media in general, as you're watching some of these fallen leaders get back in after 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. And often there's this appeal to grace, right? Well, God's grace is for me, the worst of sinners. I think it's a misunderstanding of grace. When I think about grace, I think there's a cheap version of grace that sounds a little bit more like a get out of jail free card to me, and there's a more costly grace. The kind of grace that Paul talks about when he talks about leaving one way of life and entering another way of life, leaving it behind, dying to a particular way that you've lived. That dying takes time, right? Paul himself had to go into the desert for 3 years. So it feels to me, and we've talked about this, you've heard me say it, like I'll just throw out the number, and this really freaks out multiple megachurch pastors that I've talked to and done this work with, where I said, you have to be out for 10 years. And imagine the panic. But it's my way of saying you've got to be out for a significant period of time. We don't need to say 10, maybe it's 8 years, but you have to get out. And when I talk about get out, get away, give it 15.
Draw a line in the sand and stick with it.
One quick story.
Yes.
I did this probably 12, 13 years ago. Ran into the guy probably in 2016, 2017 on the streets of San Francisco where I used to live, and bumped into one another. And I thought it would be awkward because I was the one who said, you need to be out of ministry for 10 years. How are you doing? I'm doing great. I'm beginning to get my feet wet again in ministry. And I got nervous. And so I said, tell me a little bit about that. He said, well, I'm volunteering for a church cleaning toilets. And I figured that would be a really good place to start. That was it. That's it right there. Yeah.
And do you think he was cynical journalist? It wasn't faux ability.
Vulnerability.
Faux vulnerability.
Yeah,
It wasn't like I'm saying the things that I know that you want me to say.
No,
Look at me cleaning the toilets. Wow, I'm so humble.
No, I mean, we ran into one another. It wasn't some sort of setup. It wasn't some sort of evaluation. We literally ran into one another. It had been 8 years and it felt so genuine, so sincere. Yeah, it was really kind of beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, people will ask me this, and I think about the 10 years measure a lot, and I think about the fact that you just reflected that few people take that road. I don't have a specific, I'm not a pastoral minister, I'm not counseling pastors, just in terms of observation of trends and dynamics, and I'm coming back in 4 to 5, 6 months, and we're all so excited because it's
And I'm writing a book.
about my production.
Yeah.
I need to write.
And by the way, you're probably not going to acquire projects, right?
I'll check with my boss, but I don't see that being something we would naturally gravitate toward. I tend to think about the question, why do you want to get back to the spotlight? And if there's a clamoring to get back to the spotlight, almost without doubt, you are not ready for it. Because you are entering into the very space that led to specific, lacking in proximity, abuses of power, grandiosity that led to the downfall. Why would you, there's a real element of addiction to the spotlight here, addiction to the praise and the audience. Why would you go back to that after not having given yourself the time to detox by being hidden, by being an ordinary Christian, by not being in the spotlight? It just seems unwise. And again, I think about the enabling role and what's going on in a church or organization that wants the person back. Can you imagine your life together without that person in leadership? And if you can't, I would say that's a red flag.
Yeah.
So we have some time for questions, but I wanted to end with a question for you, Chuck, about Jesus. And both of us write in our books about how the cruciform nature of Jesus' ministry beautifully counteracts and challenges so much of what we have seen up close. And so, yeah, how does the person of Jesus compel you to keep writing about things like
narcissism?
Yeah.
You know, how does Jesus give you a path forward as this counteracting force or example for the church?
Yeah. Well, first of all, chapter 8 of Katelyn's book, The Obscure Messiah and Ordinary Faithfulness. This is gold. I mean, you walk through the life of Jesus and you answer the question far more eloquently than I do. I really just point back to Philippians chapter 2.
Mhm.
Jesus, who did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. The language that's used of Adam and Eve, right? Grasped or exploited, but became nothing, who became a servant, right? There's something there that's really, really important for us.
Mhm.
We look for the superhuman pastor. Jesus was fully human, right? And in a sense, kind of disappointing in that sense. You go through the 3 temptations and you use now, and really, really good from Matthew chapter 4. You're not spectacular enough for us, Jesus. You're not powerful enough for us, Jesus. But I come back to Philippians chapter 2 every time. Jesus did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. How am I grasping? How am I exploiting? How does that require me to look at my own life? Am I grasping on social media? Am I writing? Am I teaching for compliments? You know, and so it invites us to ask particular kinds of questions. So that's kind of where I land. But I was delighted to get to your last chapter and to see how you walk through the story of Jesus, the life, the person of Jesus.
Yeah, and you know, in that chapter, I spend most of celebrities for Jesus diagnosing a problem, and then I get to the end and I'm like, oh, okay, how do I wrap this up? Maybe start with Jesus. And I'm not reinventing the wheel. I mean, there have been people, thinkers and writers like Henry Nouwen, Eugene Peterson, Thomas Merton, you know, the spiritual fathers and mothers, writing about things like obscurity, humility, hiddenness, cruciform service for even just, you know, countering dynamics of the American church for the last half century, 75 years. And it's like, they have been telling us where we need to go, and do we have the ears to hear? Do we believe that actually the cruciform life is really life? That death to self is actually the way of life and flourishing. Do we believe Jesus is an example?
Yeah.
So I thankfully didn't feel like I had anything new to offer there. Just kind of a reminder of the radically humble and counterintuitive nature of the Messiah that we follow and serve. It's not what we would have expected in our flesh, so to speak, you know?
Yeah.
So let's end with Jesus. And then also I welcome questions and comments. We have 15 or 20 minutes, and then I believe we will also have time for book signing in the back. But thank you so much for spending your evening with us. Questions, comments that come to mind?
As you're thinking on that last question, I was just thinking my favorite liturgical holiday is Ash Wednesday. I mean, make a beeline for the pastor. Let him or her impose ashes on your forehead. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. Remember your ordinariness, right? Be grounded in your ordinariness. You find Jesus there at the ground, right? So what do you got?
Let me ask a question. Maybe each of you can reflect on this a little bit. Katelyn, you and I talked a little bit about this in the process of the book, but I differentiate for me or help me think a little bit about, I think some people sort of stumble into celebrity, right? They're well-intentioned, they're doing ministry, and all of a sudden the ministry starts to grow and people are looking to them. And so, you know, so how would you differentiate between the sort of the well-intentioned blunders or the person who gets caught by surprise by their fame and the power that's attended to? But then there also are examples of something that's maybe a little more insidious. And so, yeah, talk a little bit about maybe the differences or the progression or something like that.
Yeah, in chapter 1, as you know, because you, and this is my boss. And my so I started out, just by arguing that there is a distinction between fame and celebrity. There have been people in every time and place whose work in the world or virtue or excellence, draws a kind of attention or praise unbidden. It's kind of a byproduct of something good that they've put out into the world. And then if it comes to you, then you have to figure out, how do I steward this? But the fame is not the point. The fame is an effect of what happens. And obviously, I think that can be healthy. All of us can think of plenty of famous Christians who, for all we know, stewarded that fame with a sense of groundedness. I think Eugene Peterson is a great example of someone who had, massive best-selling transliteration of the Bible, was in millions of American homes, and also stayed closely connected to a pretty small, unimpressive church for his whole pastoral ministry. Celebrity is a uniquely modern phenomenon in that it relies on mass media to project an image, and there the projection of a false self, of a persona that is impressive or flashy or whatever you want other people to perceive about you is kind of the point. That there's a kind of wielding of mass media to project an image, and I think one distinction is that it seems like fame is a bit healthier in that the work seems to be the focus, whereas with celebrity, there's an attachment and an adoration of the person as a kind of idol. There's a attachment to them to meet a kind of need. I talk about like a parasocial relationship. We have these very strange, some of us have very strange attachments to celebrities who we've never met, we've never encountered. They don't want to know us, they don't care about us, but why do I care about what's going on in this celebrity's life? What is that speaking to in our modern world? So that would be one distinction between fame and celebrity.
Yeah. I'll just say very briefly, people are often surprised when I say, there's just a small number of folks that I've worked with over the years who I would say are malicious or malignant, who sort of wake up in the morning or who went into it with that kind of intention. By far the large number, the predominant number are folks who sort of found their way to power, to fame, didn't ask for it, maybe didn't want it, didn't expect it, but now they don't have the internal resources to deal with it. And their church has grown to 1,000 or 2,000. Their social media following has grown, and there's a sense of what if I lose this? And so they become more insulated and self-protected. That's what I see more than anything else.
And at that point, they often cover with false narratives, with lies. And as those lies begin to build, they actually create another story.
Yeah.
That says, oh, I'm happily married and I'm always home with my wife, and as innocent Christians, not educated, we just haven't, we don't expect that.
Yeah.
And I think that's the shocking part, because you dedicate yourself to truth. And then it's so far out of what you believe is true.
I just keep coming back to the incredible human capacity to self-deceive that all of us have, kind of narratives working in our minds and hearts at all times, telling us, which is just all the more why having people in your life who can honestly answer the question, how do you experience me? Really, because at some point I lose the capacity. If I'm caught up in the hype and the growth and the fanfare, you lose the capacity to be honest with yourself.
That's right. Yeah. And you're with him, right? That guy, Scott, fantastic therapist, good friend. And back when we were doing therapy, I'm going to assume you'd agree with me, back in the late 90s, there wasn't a whole lot of curiosity by pastors about their inner life. They, by and large, didn't want to go to therapy. Now, when we're working with pastors, they know their Myers-Briggs and they know their Enneagram and they've been to therapy and they can talk the talk and they know their spirit animal and all the stuff, right? and it's sort of like, they come in and they're like, but I know myself and I've done the work and Chuck's my therapist or Scott's my therapist and I've looked at my own life and they're still self-deceived. And that's the scary part that we're running into more and more.
That's where search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. Find the wicked way in me and lead me out. Basically, for those of us that are not therapists, we have to know the word. That's where we find truth. And that's probably one of the hardest disciplines. For a mom, 3 children, her husband's working, but maybe she gets up and has a half hour to know the word. But
That
when
would be
the
like,
word
that would be a
speaks,
great morning for me.
yeah,
A half hours
You
reading
know,
the Bible, that would be
we're
like,
just not equipped to face it.
Yeah.
yes. Other, yes,
I have not had the privilege of reading either of your books yet, but when I heard the topics tonight, I thought, is this more geared toward like celebrities like a Kanye West, you know, who talks about his faith in Christ one day and then is like totally different the next day. So I didn't know if it was that kind of celebrity or more like geared for ministry. So now it sounds like we're geared for pastors, but
She does write about Kanye though, and she may have an update.
I was just wondering how like, people that hang their hat on those celebrities because of their faith witness, but then what happens when that goes sour, or is that for the next one?
no, I write, I devote a chapter to, kind of asking why evangelicals do get excited when there appears to be a kind of big celebrity conversion. I mean, I grew up, kind of at the peak of youth group evangelical culture, and it was always so exciting to have like a crossover hit on mainstream radio, like they're a Christian band, like Flood is by Christians, but it's on the top 40 radio, like, and I talk about the desire for cultural credibility, respectability, feeling like if you feel that your faith tradition is losing cultural ground or kind of a seat at the table, it's exciting to think that somebody in the echelons of cultural power could speak up for your faith. And then, yes, of course, it doesn't take but one example of Kanye West to realize that this is, we should not put our ultimate faith in these figures because you don't know what they're gonna say. So, yes.
You guys were talking earlier about the leadership cult kind of in our current cultural moment, and just mentioned that there's a number of people who have written about the topic. I'm curious if you could just share like a couple of resources for engaging the topic of the leadership cult.
We both look at each other. I don't know. I don't feel like I know this world as well. I mean, I know books about leadership, but books that specifically challenge the dominant leadership mold that we're dealing with.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of, I guess when I went to were folks like Diane Langberg's Redeeming Power, Scott McKnight's and Lord Marriage's a church called Tove, Wade Mullen's Something's Not Right, right? But I think what was really interesting though is that, and there are a number of those that came out a couple of years ago, and you tell me if this is kind of what you're getting at, but here's what Katelyn's book does, is there are all these kinds of divergent experiences that have happened over the last 2 or 3 years, and books that came out naming different aspects of sort of the psychological and cultural dynamics. And what Katelyn does is she sort of weaves it together into a coherent story. And sometimes we need people to do that for us. I felt less crazy after I read the book, like, oh, there is actually a narrative storyline here that I can follow. That brings me to kind of our present day and connects some of the dots. And so, but I would look at her bibliography for some of the resources for that too.
Yeah, I was gonna say then I'll definitely purchase Katelyn's book. So.
Yes.
First of all, I want to say thank you for writing and talking about these hard things. These are the things that we are called to do. We are not called to an easy life. We are called to speak out about things that are not right in the world we live in. So thank you for writing and talking about this stuff.
Yeah.
I love, Katelyn, that you talked about the cruciform life in one of your earlier comments. That is something that we as a church, and my little church that I'm pastor of, we are trying to talk about. It is not easy. And as you mentioned, the cruciform life, I had the wondering of the discipleship piece. In your research, did you find anything that was particularly helpful in how we are discipling people? Are we talking about things like how we engage and how people know us? Your questions about how people know us is really good. I wrote and circled that 100 times. That is really good. Was there anything that you could expand on related to discipleship? Additional thoughts on that stuff?
Yeah, I don't have specific ideas for kind of resources that a small group could use or turn to or start practicing per se. I do think about the structure of our churches in a lot of America, United States. I grew up in a church that desperately wanted to be a mega church. I don't think we ever technically got there, but there was a mega church down the road that was our competitor. We really wanted to be like that. And like we used guitars in worship. It was really edgy. And our pastor wore open-toed sandals and he was just very relevant. And that was my entree into authentic Christian faith. And so I'm going to be indebted to that model of church for the rest of my life. And yet I do think that we tend to think of church as a place to have an individual experience where we would be entertained or inspired. Church was essentially an hour on Sunday morning. We wanted to make the bar incredibly low, not realizing that actually a lot of Americans go through life having all of their needs met and catered to. Maybe what we actually want at the end of the day is a place that asks something of us, that requires commitment or sticking it out for the long haul. And that's not me saying stay in an unhealthy church, but what if the church is one of the few places in the panoply of places that cater to our needs where it's actually not about that? It's actually, what if your felt needs are not actually telling you the truth about who you are and what you're created for? So I do think, of course, there has been a conversation now for years about smaller churches where it's possible in its structure to know the pastors. I do think about a mega church model where the pastor is kind of the purveyor or dispenser of wisdom, but like you never have a conversation with them in person in your life. I tend to think that smaller churches that are thinking deeply about calling out something like commitment to one another and stability over the long haul is actually what we are ready for. A lot of us are ready for it, and what a lot of us need in order to grow up as Christians.
Can I just say something about that?
Mhm.
When I think about discipleship, I think much of what we often do and practice is intellectual. It's heady, it's cognitive, it's reading a book together or something like that. And it's interesting to me that Dallas Willard sort of had this crisis moment at the end of his life. Jim Wilder talks about it in the book Renovated, where he had this moment of, did my life accomplish anything? Did it amount to anything, right? And he discovered in those later days the importance of embodiment, of honoring our bodies and our emotions, and began to become curious about how our bodies and emotions are implicated in the discipleship journey. I think we need to do more there. I think that intersects with liturgical worship in beautiful kinds of ways, right? So here we are now entering into the Advent season soon. during a time when we are already beginning to see ads for Black Friday, buy, consume, purchase, take, hoard, in the midst of a season that says wait, long, rest. How are our bodies implicated in that when my nervous system literally starts to feel it? You know, like this is a season where I start to feel like I need more, purchase, right? So I think this is the conversation in some ways for the church today.
Good time for.
17 more questions. Oh, sorry.
Okay, yes, you in the front.
Do you think that it seems like because culture has been so social media oriented, it's sort of pushed the celebrity culture to this crazy space? But do you think that also culture, because we want something different and because people are more aware of what they want? I mean, I have 5 kids who grew up in the church who are all looking for something different. But do you think that because this generation is gonna look for something different, the likelihood of continuing to build these big celebrity personas in evangelicalism or Christianity is going to decline because people are looking for something different? You know what I mean?
Like how we lost the taste. We've seen the effects or we've seen the outcomes.
We saw it happen. So we eat organic, we buy sustainable, and we're gonna look for a church that isn't a celebrity church. I think that the shift is going to drive. Yeah, I'm just curious about how you foresee, like, is this a blip in church history that we have this celebrity culture, but we're all recognizing it and moving forward? Nobody's gonna want it, and our eyes are gonna be open to it in a different way.
I don't have a lot of hope that a majority of American Christians will be able to resist the ascendancy of celebrity culture. Like, I don't think that this is going away. I think that there will be a minority of people who are aware of the dynamics and are intentionally choosing a different way. But I think we're swimming in these waters and a lot of people aren't aware of it. I can't speak to Gen Z. They could be, for all of the TikTok videos that they create that I'm supposed to be aware of, maybe, yeah, maybe they are wiser than my generation is, or the baby. I do think a lot of this comes back to the baby boomers. I'm sorry. Wait, are you a baby boomer? No, sorry. I mean, some people out there, baby boomers.
Back in my day, in the past, smartphones.
Right. Sorry, John.
Gen X. Very critical. We could deal with the baby boomers.
Yeah, you
Yeah, we
reject
love
it.
couches and candles and incense and poetry and art. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I want to end with, I do think that the baby boomers are the progenitors of a lot of the things we are now having to deal with in the church. But I don't know, it's hard for me to say. I mean, of course, I hope that, people will read my book and they're, but I just, the reality is that for the American Christians who say they attend church weekly, a majority of them attend like the top 10% largest churches. So I don't have a lot of hope for the longevity of small churches, truthfully, because the mega church model really has worked. It's worked at getting people into the door at least. So it has been an effective church model. Yes, last question.
I haven't read your books yet, so I don't know if you touch on it. But we talked a lot about ministry here. What about the education sphere? So, kind of an example, if there happened to be a small Christian education who maybe had a narcissistic leader or a presumably narcissistic leader, and the student body they're kind of asking a question like, what do we do about this?
Mm.
Do you have any sort of answer for this community of young students who are just like trying to get an education without being, having the oppressed power of a narcissistic leader on them?
For some reason, this doesn't sound hypothetical. Very specific. It's a really good question. It's gosh, how do students speak up against a leadership style that is harming the community, or they feel like is shaping them in unhealthy ways, or representing the seminary or college in the public square in ways that counteract their values?
I mean, the dynamics are really similar.
Mm.
I think what's different now, well, back in my day, we didn't have social media. And what's really interesting now is there's a power you all have that we didn't have. It was simply they were in charge and they did what they did, and there was nothing that we could do. What's for good or for ill, now there is this platform that you can use to tell these kinds of stories. And we've seen a lot of good come out of this kind of storytelling. And we've seen accountability within institutions, right? Of course, so democratized and that everyone has a voice, and there are stories that are told that aren't as helpful or true, but I do think that students by and large have a larger voice, and there's a lot of anxiety as someone who works in an institution. There's a lot of anxiety among leaders of institutions these days because of this new level of accountability. So yeah, we are in a, getting back to this question, a pretty pivotal moment, right? I keep calling it a moment of reckoning. And this seems to happen about every 500 years, this Phyllis Tickle called it, this rummage sale, right? And we're in a period of dying, and I think we're in the beginning of it. I think it will get worse. And that means an erosion within our institutions of trust. But this has been going on for a long time. Back in my day, do you remember the show Quiz Show? Quiz Show was the very first where there was a scandal, right? And back then there was this public trust with what you heard on TV. And suddenly there was this Quiz Show was when? 1950s? Suddenly there was a sense of we can't trust people talking at us through a TV. Look where we are today. And so this has been going on for now, what, 70 years? So we're right in the thick of it. So if you feel like, oh, this is kind of a new thing, we've got a couple of new books out, we're really sort of at a moment of massive reckoning where the dying is just beginning. And by the way, Jesus makes new things. When things die, new things come of it, right? And so we trust that.
And nothing essential will die. The things that are dying, I think reckoning is the word that has come to mind and many others' minds over the last several years. The things that are being exposed and brought to light and are shown to be counteracting the gospel, are shown to be in direct contradiction to the gospel. Let those things die. Like, let it all out, because I really do believe that on the other side of this process, however long it takes, can be an opportunity for new life and for a healthier, more Christ-like model of Christian faithfulness in the world. So I say, bring it on.
Bring on the diet.
Thank you all for your participation tonight, for your great questions.